Hello, my name's Adam and I'm the founder of Small99, and in this video I just want to talk you through your results page and give you a bit of detail of how we came to these figures behind the scenes and what's going on, but also just talk you through your results page so you know what you're looking at. If we start at the top, we've got two figures immediately, 3.27 tonnes, which is on this demo account, the per tonne employee. That figure is a carbon intensity metric that allows you to compare your carbon emissions to others in your sector or maybe your competitors. In terms of the total figure, that is the total amount of emissions that your organisation is generating over roughly a year period. If we then come down, we see the per employee figure being used again to compare as a benchmark against others in our database to give you an idea of where you sit compared to others that are similar size to you. This is the benefit of the per employee figure, is that it allows even a very large organisation and a very small organisation to compare their total footprint. If we come down, we can see the different categories, and the reason why we've done it this way is just because no one really understands what scopes mean. It gets very confusing, and therefore the technical language isn't really necessary, but hopefully this gives you a good idea of the rough breakdown of your emissions. If we then move a bit further down, we can click on the additional information, and this brings up that technical scope language, and unsurprisingly the majority of your emissions are likely going to be in your scope 3, and then scopes 1 and 2 are relatively minimal. And we can see a bit of a breakdown here as well around the different footprints, and I'll come on to some common questions we get about this as well. So in terms of your footprint and how we've come to this figure, one of the main ways in which we try and accelerate the process is by asking some very simple questions, and based on industry research we can gather some idea and some assessments to put together a rough figure of how much you're using. Most businesses are not necessarily that unique, apart from manufacturing or some really large industrial processes. If you are professional services or you are running from a light industrial unit, it's quite likely that your footprint is relatively predictable, and therefore that this is a relatively accurate score. And we have had some people report between 80 and 90% against their manually measured footprints in terms of this figure, so it might be that this is actually quite accurate. However, do bear in mind it is an estimate. The way that we get to those estimated figures is, for example, light bulbs. It's likely that we can guess that there's going to be around 5 light bulbs per person in a building, and therefore we know that they are either going to be LED or they might be old-fashioned incandescent bulbs. We know that a LED light bulb is typically between 5 and 10 watts, and we know that an incandescent bulb is normally between 50 and 100 watts. And therefore, if we have 5 light bulbs at say 10 watts or 100 watts, we can start to extrapolate out how many employees you have, roughly how many light bulbs you have, and therefore the total power that's being consumed by those light bulbs, and therefore the total emissions. It's those sort of assumptions where we've used our industry research and just our experience in talking to businesses to come to these broad themes and trends that we can extrapolate out from to get an idea of your footprint without necessarily needing too much information. And for example, if you say you've got 10 employees, we're going to guess that most of those people are driving into work, and we've taken some averages that's normally around 9 miles per day, so that if they are driving by car, well, the government data says that most people are commuting around 9 miles, and again, we can make some assumptions and extrapolate out of that. That's not always going to be accurate. If everyone's walking to work, or only one person's driving, but maybe they're driving a really large vehicle and everyone else is walking, there are going to be some nuances here, and that's why it's important to go on and measure your footprint in full. But again, this gets you started on that journey. Now, one of the common questions we get asked is around working from home. If you've got a lot of people working from home, you may not have asked many questions, and you may have ended up on this results page relatively quickly. The reason for that is because the government provide a kilograms of carbon emissions per hour for home working that has been estimated out that using various methods, again, of the average energy consumption, the average gas bills, the average heating of different homes. And we're using that figure to say, well, if you are entirely working from home, it's unlikely that a lot of these other bigger emissions that you tend to get generated, such as commuting and business travel, may not be quite as applicable, and therefore we're able to use that 0.34 kilos per hour for home working that then extrapolates out. That isn't, again, always going to be relevant to you. If you've got solar panels, a battery pack, a heat pump, that figure is going to be too high and may not be accurate. However, it's important to understand that If you're professional services and working entirely from home, your footprint is going to be relatively small, and really you should be thinking about the impact you can have on others, especially if you are dealing with other business customers. If we then start to look at, for example, transport, one of the common questions we get as well is why does your commuting emissions look quite high? So in this case, we can see here, it's not actually that bad. Commuting's around 2.5 tonnes. The majority is coming from purchased goods and services. However, it might be that your commuting is the opposite of this and it's really high, even though you said that you were working remotely. The reason for that is because the Greenhouse Gas Protocol recommends that all all working from home emissions are included in your commuting emissions. And therefore that is the correct category according to the official way of measuring this, that it goes in there. That might not be the most obvious or most sensible to you. However, that is what is technically correct, and therefore that is what we've gone with. But it may mean that your commuting emissions are much larger than you actually think they should be. Another common question we get asked is around energy providers, in that, well, if you're using a renewable energy provider, why are we saying that buildings and energy is 3.5 tonnes? There's a couple of reasons for that. One, gas usage. If you answered that you do have gas on site, there's no way to really have zero emissions from gas because you're burning something, and therefore we're going to assume that anyway. And two, even if you're using only electric heating and you are fully renewable on your electricity provider, again, it depends on the provider whether you can claim that as entirely renewable or not. The reason why is that there are these things called REGOs, or Renewable Energy Certificates of Origin, of Guaranteed Origin, some sort of language or jargon around that, where it's only if certain providers can guarantee where that electricity was generated through those certificated schemes as to whether you can count that as zero. And the best thing to do is, if you are looking to measure manually, is to email your energy provider and ask for their actual official emissions figures. They should be able to give you those certificates to prove that they're only buying energy from a certain source. That is why, again, it is likely that we've assumed you've not done that, and we are assuming that you are using the grid level emissions. So the figures are all based off of the last year's energy emissions from the UK government at a grid level. Even if you're using, it's really hard to track an electron and claim that that is entirely your thing, and therefore there is going to be some emissions in there somewhere, and so it's really difficult to really guarantee that as zero. That does not mean you shouldn't use renewable energy, because obviously the more you use renewable energy and more people that are using providers, the more demand there is for other people to then be buying those renewable energy assets and building them. In terms of digital emissions, sometimes working from home or digital emissions can feel quite low. An example here is that it's around 0.03 tonnes, and there's good reason for that, in that digital emissions often make up quite a small part of your carbon footprint when compared to buildings and energy or something like supply chain. If you've got a domestic boiler at home, that is going to be pumping out far more emissions than something like emails. An example being, for Small 99, we measured our digital footprint, and Google provides these tools for all of the emails, all of the hosting, all of the energy we're using, and it equates to around between 2 and 3 kilos per month that we are using on that, depending on how many video calls we have, which does tend to increase it slightly. Now that 3 kilos is equivalent to driving around 10 miles in a petrol car. So you start to see that these transport and buildings and heating and moving things takes up a lot more energy than something like digital does, unless you are using something like, maybe you're a wedding photographer where you're storing terabytes and terabytes of data, in which case it can start to add up much more quickly. But typically even emails, if you're sending them, again as a professional service person working from home, are going to be quite small compared to the rest of your footprint. So do bear that in mind. Something else that you might have noticed here is that this tool does have its limits, and it might not be very useful. For example, if you are a hotel chain or a restaurant and you're producing quite a lot of food waste, that is probably going to be much more than the figures here, because food waste is quite high carbon. And equally, if you're a logistics company moving a lot of vans around, or you're doing a lot of deliveries, we've not really asked about that at this stage. So it might be that might be a little bit out, and you might need to up your transport emissions a little bit. So it's not a perfect tool. However, perfection is the enemy of done, and therefore you've actually started your footprint. That is the main thing. So congratulations on starting that first step on your journey, and hopefully this gives you some ideas and insights based on this wheel of where you can start taking action next. If you'd like to read more about our methodology, if you go to the bottom of the page, there is a link called How We Estimate, and that brings up a new page where it gives you much more information on our data and our approaches and just some kind of caveats of where the weaknesses lie. Hopefully that gets you started, and any comments, pop below. Speak to you soon.